It is great to be joined today by Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist and professor at New York University's Stern School of Business. He's the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, including The Righteous Mind. The new book, co-authored with Greg Lukianoff, is The Coddling of the American Mind. Jonathan, so great to talk to you. I really appreciate you joining me.
Oh, my pleasure, David.
There's so much to talk about and so much in your book that's relevant to what's going on in the sort of American state of politics right now. And I was sort of struggling with how to maybe enter the conversation. And maybe one way would be, if we want to think now about the ways in which the American electorate sort of exists in its polarized state, there are lots of hypotheses about the spectrum we should be looking at. There is religion, there's race, there's simply left-right political ideology, there's authoritarian versus libertarian, all of these different ways. If I were to just open it up to you and say, what is the most relevant lens in your mind through which we can understand American political polarization now, what would it be?
So I would say that we've gone through a long transition in which long ago material interests and then race and other identity factors were the primary determinants of political coalitions. But as societies get wealthier and more educated, morals and personality actually end up becoming more and more important. So it's crucial to understand why we're in such a mess now. You have to understand that the late 20th century was a real anomaly. Throughout the mid-20th century, we actually had, and into the late century, we had conservative Democrats in the South. We had liberal Republicans in the Northeast and the West Coast. So things weren't, our parties were not perfect personality sorts, and now they are. If you give someone a personality test, you can now guess which side they're on. There's a wonderful report out from a group in Britain called More in Common. They put out this Hidden Tribes report, and they found that when you give Americans a whole bunch of attitude questions that are not even about politics, just about morals and values, that does a better job sorting people than if you know everything about their race and religion and other things.
Is there, or let's see how I can couch this, is there something about the political system's setup that is fomenting the polarization that we're seeing, in the sense that from an electoral perspective, there's not that much incentive to sort of find common ground and get along for both reasons of how politics is financed and for other reasons? So I guess the question is, does the political system foment disagreement and polarization?
Yes, in a lot of ways. So let's start with this. The worst number of political parties to have in a country is 1. Okay, that's really bad. But the second worst number is probably 2. There's even research showing that if you have 2 contestants, you get all the normal stuff of us versus them. If you simply add another one somewhere, even if it's not that important, the hatred here becomes less. There's something about us versus them that really activates our ancient tribal circuits. So having a 2-party system, as we do in America, it was not the founders' intent, but it became the reality even as they were debating the Constitution. Whereas in Europe, they have parliamentary systems. Those are a little more resistant to this kind of nasty polarization. That's one. Then there's also the fact that our electoral system, most of our states have closed party primaries. And so since very few people turn out to vote in the primaries, it's mostly the passionate extremists. So our primary system tends to choose people who are more expressive, shall we say. Then there's changes in the media environment. And so now here there's some asymmetry, but people who have more extreme views can have a pretty good career, especially in the right-wing media space. Obviously, the left does tend to dominate the mainstream media, so I'm not trying to take sides here, but I think the facts are the mainstream media does lean left. The right-leaning media is more of a sort of a commercial outrage industry. There's a book called The Outrage Industry that I think does a really good job of that. So for a whole bunch of reasons, the mid to late 20th century was unusual in, you might say, having a lot of centripetal forces pulling us together. And the overlap of the parties, the Republicans, et cetera, that issue. And then the fact that we had 3 television networks for much of the century that were fairly centralizing. In a lot of ways, those centripetal forces that were very strong mid-20th century including having common enemies from Hitler through the Soviets. Those fell away in the late 20th century, and especially the early 2000s. And now the centrifugal forces blowing us apart are much stronger than they've been in a long time, I think.
Can we go back a little bit to, I want to see what your thoughts are on this idea that the mainstream media, other than the right-wing outrage industry, is predominantly left. Because when I look at analyses that look at sort of people's beliefs based on the media that they consume, I'm not really seeing that leftward lean. I'm seeing a very sort of pro-corporate lean when it comes to, as I call it, the corporate media rather than mainstream media. But on what sort of empirical basis can we say most mainstream or corporate media leans left?
So if you look at the big five personality traits, there's a lot of research on personality and occupation. And so people who score high on openness to experience tend to gravitate to the arts and media and the academy. So that my part of the world, the academy, leans left. And most of that is just natural selection. Just like, look, if you survey police departments and military and, large parts of the corporate world, they tend to lean right. In a free society, people are going to choose jobs that they like. And so people who choose to be reporters, who choose to live a life of uncovering the truth, uncovering scandal, questioning power, the media always attracts many more people on the left than the right. So even at the Wall Street Journal, as far as I know, most of the actual reporters, forget the editorial page, that's a whole separate kettle of fish. But the reporters tend to be Democrats. Even when I've spoken at military academies, you'd think the academy leans left, but you'd think like at West Point or in the military academies, you'd think they'd be conservatives. And no, even there, they tend to lean left. They're just not nearly as far left. So a lot of this is just very natural part of a free society. Reporters tend to lean left. And so when you look at the way news is covered, when you look at the subtle choices made, again, this is not a conspiracy theory. I mean, I think our best journal, the New York Times, I think the Atlantic is a wonderful publication. They have very high journalistic standards. I'm not saying, oh, the mainstream media. I'm just saying, just as a fact about who's in the industries, it tends to be people who are voting for the Democrats, and that has a subtle influence.
Wouldn't we need to demonstrate that? I mean, in other words, so I'm in agreement with you that there's no question that it seems as though the majority of reporters are sort of self-identified on the left. But if we want to make an analysis about the impact of that on polarization, we may want to demonstrate that that's coming through in a way that is biasing the audience. And I guess that's what I've not seen.
Oh, so there's a huge amount of research literature on whether it matters. I don't know that literature, so I can't comment on it.
Okay.
But I think the most reasonable way to approach this, I think, is to say that there's not a symmetry here. That is, there are issues with the mainstream media that I think is generally, and now I think we're really coming to appreciate the value of having professionals handling the news rather than any person with a website and a following. Whereas the right-wing media has evolved, especially in the shadow of originally cable TV, which allowed narrowcasting. So again, the book here is called The Outrage Industry by, I forget the first author, but the second author is Sarah Sobieraj. That's a wonderful book if you want to understand more about how this all works.
Let's talk about this asymmetrical circumstance that we sort of find ourselves in. One element that I've sort of been following is that there seems to be a sort of asymmetrical polarization or radicalization that has taken place. I'm curious whether you agree. One such example would be that if we look at the abortion debate, just to pick one, I mean, we could pick any issue, that we have seen what I've identified as more and more radical positions on the right, whereas the position on the left does not seem to have gone further to the left. It's not abortions all the time up until a child is 10 years old, right? There's not been a sort of symmetrical...
There's a sort of a natural stopping point.
There's a natural stopping point that we've seen. That's one example, and there could be others. Do you agree that there's been an asymmetrical radicalization that has shifted the Overton window to the right? Or am I biased in perceiving that?
Kind of both. So let's take it one step at a time. There's a wonderful book called "It's Even Worse Than It Looks" by Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann, who are really experts on Congress. Now, Norm Ornstein is at AEI, a conservative think tank, but he personally is more of a progressive, I think. But I think they're both. I like them both a lot. I think they're very wise.
Yeah.
And then when their book came out in 2012, they had some great phrase that got repeated all around. It was like that. It was about asymmetric polarization. It was about the Republican Party has become, what do they call it, an insurgent outlier. Like basically, the Republican Party by 2010, and so it began with Newt Gingrich, had evolved, had moved further to the right, was doing more and more things that at very least you could say challenged or subverted the norms of Congress. So I do agree that the right changed more, the right moved more. Now, there are some political scientists and some conservatives who dispute this. This is the difficulty of social science. You make an argument with one data set, somebody else says, well, but if you look at something else. But I think it is fair to say that the Republicans got more radical, more angry, and were more likely to act in ways that were out of character, out of the character of Congress in previous decades. With that said, though, I think we do have to point out that since especially 2000, since the George W. Bush administration, and maybe it goes back to the late Clinton administration, there's been an incredible rage visible in whichever party doesn't control the White House. So under Clinton, there were all kinds of conspiracy theories and a lot of people who hated him. But under George W. Bush, people talked about Bush derangement syndrome. There were some people on the left who couldn't think clearly because they hated Bush so much. And then Obama comes in, and suddenly those people become sane again. But now there's an even more radical, insane far right with all their conspiracy theories, and some people who proposed that Trump wasn't. I mean that Obama wasn't born in America. And now, of course, with Trump in the White House, many people on the left are even more crazy. Now, I don't want to say that Trump is similar to Obama and it's just going back and forth. Trump is not. I mean, Trump is beyond anything we've ever had in the White House. I think he's I can't speak as a psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but his personal behavior and the way that he thinks is not how to put it. He seems to be playing a game where everything is mostly about him rather than necessarily about policy. That's the most polite way to put it, I suppose. But I think that we cannot see what's going on unless we at least hear from the other side. So every time I've tried to say, look at all the innovations the Republicans did that are subverting democracy, my conservative friends will point out something that the Democrats did too. So I'm just saying it's hard to know the truth until you listen to all the sides.
Is there, I've interviewed David Dunning of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and we've talked about sort of the limits that sometimes people have to identify flaws in their own thinking or to understand why they may not fully understand something. Is that lack of metacognition something that plays a particular role in politics, or is it just metacognition's a phenomenon that exists for Homo sapiens broadly, but it's not particularly pernicious in politics?
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Well, my last book, The Righteous Mind, it was all about how we evolved to play certain games in small-scale societies of 50 to 150 people. We are much more concerned about our reputation than we are about just about anything else, with the possible exception of our children. And so I side with the various cognitive psychologists who've argued that language and reasoning evolved not to help us find the truth, but to help us manipulate others and play the social game of reputation management. So that's part of social life. And in politics, it just ramps it up. So it's very, I write a lot about post hoc reasoning and motivated reasoning, and it's easy to see that in other people. And, it's really hard to see it in yourself. And when you then go to politics, it's even easier to see it in the other people and often harder to see it in yourself. What I would add here is that this isn't just about individuals and their flaws. This is about group versus group fighting for the future of the country. People feel as though it's an existential battle, and it is. It's much more so now than it was in many previous decades. So it's group versus group. And so anybody who tries to see nuance, like, if you're on the left, how many people have you heard on the left say, I disagree with Trump on almost everything, but, I think he was right on point 3. It's very hard to say that, because if you suggest that maybe there's some nuance here, you could suffer some real social blowback. And again, this is nothing particular about the left. Obviously, the right is quite savage about its mavericks. In general, we like mavericks when they're from the other party, but a maverick in our own party is a traitor, and we generally hate them.
Yeah, I actually identified 3 points that I don't totally disagree with Trump on. 2 of them I forgot just while we've been chatting
Well,
here, but I'm going to try to remember.
Motivated forgetting, perhaps.
That's a good place to pause. We're speaking with Jonathan Haidt. The most recent book, co-authored with Greg Lukianoff, is The Coddling of the American Mind. We will take a break and pick up our conversation with him tomorrow. We're continuing our conversation today with Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist, professor at NYU's Stern School of Business. We are speaking about a lot of things, but partially, at least, about his new book, co-authored with Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind. Let's maybe pick up our conversation on the topic of values. I've recently interviewed a lot of interesting and different people, including Nathan J. Robinson and many others, and there seems to be somewhat of a split about whether one side, in order to convince the other side, to use sort of simple terms when it comes to politics, whether it's useful to make arguments that appeal to what we perceive the other's values to be. In other words, if you are on the left and you are for a woman's right to choose, and for you, the values of the right on abortion aren't really the important ones, is it effective to use values that sound like they are the ones of your opponents in order to get people to re-examine their beliefs? Do you think that that's a useful tactic or not a particularly useful tactic?
Oh, yes. I mean, so first of all, it's straight out of Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, is you talk to people about their interests, not about yours. Second, there is direct research on this. Let me see if I can find the references. Feinberg and Willer. There's a team of social psychologists who, let me see if I can find a research summarizing their points. But they basically instructed people, I think Feinberg has a TED Talk on this, where they instructed people to make arguments about something, people on the left or people on the right make arguments the other side, and people will spontaneously make the argument in terms of their own side's moral values. They used the moral foundations theory, a theory that I and some other social psychologists created, where we basically find that people on the left tend to base their appeals on issues of care and fairness, where fairness is often about equality. And whereas conservatives have that, but conservatives also value a lot group loyalty, respect for authority, and a sense of sanctity or purity. So at least there are some differences of value between the left and the right. And people will spontaneously couch an argument in their own side's values, and it's not very effective at persuading others. But if you tell them, why don't you redo this, but now put it in terms of the other side's values, they can do it, and it actually is more persuasive. So I think we know the answer. Now, obviously, if you do it badly, if you do it clumsily, and you alienate the person, it's going to backfire. But if you can do it skillfully, yes, that's like the secret of political persuasion.
What do you make of the way in which values have become sort of a battleground within this context of what is sometimes called the social justice warrior phenomenon, or the virtue signaling social media phenomenon? And I guess what I mean by that is the use of values to signal others in a way that maybe is not the most productive when it comes to the actual arguments and problems we're trying to figure out. I guess question one is, how big of a problem do you think it is? Because I've, as someone on the left, been critical of that where I see it existing. I just don't think it's nearly as big a problem as some have made it out to be.
Yeah, I think it's a much bigger problem than some have made it out to be.
Really?
And this is the reason. So if you and I are talking in private, I might actually be trying to persuade you.
Yeah.
But if we're talking in front of 1,000 people, I don't actually care about you. I'm totally focused on looking good in front of my people. And so if I'm going to say things, if I'm going to get credit, if I'm going to manage my reputation, the stronger, the harder I hit, the more uncompromising I am, the more I show that I'm on the right side to my people, the better that is to me. I don't care about the whole world. I care about the people that are in my group or that are going to judge me. And so social media, unfortunately, puts us all in this situation where whatever we say, we will be judged. And so we're signaling it. We've always been incentivized to signal. But here's what I think has happened, especially to young people. Social media has put them into what you might call an economy of prestige, where the way you get credit is by showing either that you've been victimized or by standing up for someone else who's been victimized. And so this is what leads to a call-out culture. If somebody says something perfectly innocent, but you find a way that you can say, well, that's racist or sexist. Like, a teenager wears a dress with a Chinese theme to it, and you find a way, you can call her out for that, for insensitivity. You might get points in your team, but to the rest of the world, you look ridiculous. You look incredibly intolerant, small-minded. So that incident, I forget the young woman's name who wore this Chinese dress to her prom.
Yeah.
The fact that people tried to shame her, that looks really, really bad for the left. And when you have a succession of these things, it's pretty much every day you got a story like that. So many people, and remember, America, I mean, there's 8% on the left that are the progressive activist tribe. That's what this Hidden Tribes report says. There's 6% on the far right that are the committed conservatives. Those are the real authoritarians, and a lot of them are really racist. You got those two extreme groups. But most Americans are somewhere in the middle. They're still pretty open-minded. They're willing to compromise. If the left loses them, if the left turns off a lot of people who otherwise lean left, that's a big problem. And I think that could be a big problem for the Democrats going into 2020, depending on which way they go here.
Yeah, I guess I'm just not sure. So I completely agree with your analysis. I just am not seeing that it's a predominant narrative on the left. In other words, I every day, whenever I take phone calls from the left, it's wide open phones. People can call in and ask about anything they want. We get emails, we get Facebook comments. I'm paying attention to what's going on in prominent Twitter, left-wing influence circles. I just don't see that much of it. The majority of the discussion I'm seeing is about how can we get healthcare to everybody, even if they can't afford it? How can we reduce income inequality? Why aren't we dealing with the climate? And so I guess, how can we empirically identify that this is really a major problem?
Yeah. So if you're within a discourse community, most people are pretty reasonable. Even if you're just within the discourse community of activists on the left, most people are well-intentioned, mentally stable, interested in policy. And so let's suppose 1,000 things are said in your community, and 5 of that 1,000 are kind of like crazy, intolerant, what's called the intolerant left. Well, in your community, you say, look, we're pretty reasonable. But it's those 5 comments that are going to be retweeted and shown on right-wing media. Now, it turns out the Russians were doing a lot of this. I mean, we're all pretty good at being Russian bots ourselves. That was the finding of a big study at MIT, that you don't need Russian bots to get polarization. But it turns out, we just learned, this week, the Russians were doing even more than we thought to cause racial conflict, left-right conflict. So within your community, most people are reasonable, but it generates enough stuff that there's a daily diet. Every single day, people on the left and the right send me things with basically the messages, can you believe those people? They're completely sick. And it's from both sides, because there are 350 million of us in this country. And every day, between 10 and 100 on each side do horrible things. And we should mostly just ignore them. I mean, we used to ignore them because we didn't know about them. But social media means that we know about all the worst things from the other side every day. And that makes it very hard to keep our minds. We're all losing our minds because we are stuffed every day with outrage stories. And the other side is stuffed with outrage stories too. So I'm very pessimistic about the future of our country and actually the future of Western democracies. I don't know. I imagine someday we'll find a way to adapt to it. But the way that social media is now, it just sort of taps in or jacks into so many circuits in our minds that I think it is driving us crazy, and it's going to make it very difficult for us to coexist with people on the other side. Some people refuse even to work with someone who voted for the other candidate.
Yeah, it seems, I mean, when I hear you talking about that, it seems to suggest that in some way the problem is that of how others react to these enclaves that exist. We've been talking about this one on the left, as you said, it exists on the right, because even if we're talking about a small percentage of people, the destructive impact of it is what to me seems like it's a disabling, a sort of self-inflicted error that the left makes when it focuses on these issues, because it sort of prevents reasonable debate from even taking place.
That's right. Plus, here's another thing that I think people on the left, it would really help to understand. So I'm in a world in which everybody's on the left. I mean, there's like 5 people I could name that are conservatives in the academy.
Now, are you saying in your at NYU, or what do you mean 5?
Okay, I'm exaggerating. There's more than 5 conservative academics.
Okay.
But in terms of but if you ask professors, name a conservative academic, I mean, there are 4 or 5 that we can all name, and beyond that, we kind of run out. So it's a very left. I mean, it's not that everybody's on the left per se. There are actually, it turns out there are a fair number of moderates, but there's hardly anybody right of center. My point is just that more and more every year, every month, I find more and more people who are on the left, and they said some innocent thing and they were crucified for it. They were shamed. They were called racist, sexist, homophobic. No, but you misunderstood. It doesn't matter. And when that happens, these people get very bitter. I mean, when you're falsely accused, and especially if you're publicly shamed, you get very bitter. And so there's a wonderful line from, I think it's For Whom the Bell Tolls, whichever Hemingway novel is in Italy in World War I. And at some point, if I remember correctly, at some point, the side he was fighting for, they end up shooting at him, and he gets totally disillusioned. And he says, and suddenly, the whole war mattered to me about as much as somebody else's college football game. And I think this happens to a lot of people because they always come back and say, but wait, I'm very progressive. Wait, I did this and I did this. I have really good progressive credentials, but that defense doesn't help you. You are still publicly shamed. And when this happens to people, you're losing allies. You're alienating people. And if it's people who aren't attached to the left but were in the center, you're pushing them to Trump. A lot of people voted for Trump because they're just sick and tired of being shamed for what they think are not offensive statements. So yeah, you generally don't win people over to your side by attacking them. And so the more people of a sliver of the left, the more they accuse people in their schools, in their companies, wherever they are, the more accusations they make, the more support the left loses.
To sort of start winding down our conversation, to take that and look at another election that you've commented on, you've argued that Democrats in 2000 and 2004 lost partially, if I understand your position correctly, because they couldn't discuss morality in a way that was effective for them to garner votes. What do you mean by that?
So a bunch of us were writing about this at the time. You can find a similar argument in George Lakoff, Moral Politics, and in Drew Weston's book, I think it was called The Political Brain. We were all noticing that from Ronald Reagan through George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan was quite eloquent. He could do this on his own. George W. Bush was not eloquent, but he had good speechwriters. The Republicans would talk about politics, and this is only true about national politics. Local politics is dirty business. Local politics is not like religion. National politics in the United States is like religion. And the president puts himself forth, or the candidate puts himself forth, as the high priest of the American civic religion. And you have to talk about how great America is, and the flag, and the founding documents, and the founding fathers, American values, the American dream. So the Republicans have always been good at this. And the Democrats, many of them have not. Now, Clinton was great. Clinton could do it, and it's important that he's from the South. But especially when I was growing up, Michael Dukakis, and then, of course, Al Gore and John Kerry, their approach to winning the presidency was, we have a policy, and our policy gives you more than the other guy's policy. And so, we care about you because we're going to give you a better program. And that doesn't stir the heart. So I think the Democrats tended to misunderstand. They tended to think that the way to persuade someone is to appeal to their interests. Now, Obama was much better. Obama is very eloquent, and Obama, my wife and I fell in love with Obama when we listened to Dreams from My Father. We listened to that book on tape or CD, and he reads it and he does all the voices, and he understands black people, white people, Indonesians, American. He really understands people, and he could speak to their values, especially as a candidate. Not quite as good once in office, but he was, I think, a wonderful candidate at doing that. So yeah, that's what I meant. You have to understand the religious nature of all social life. Well, especially of politics and sports and other groupish activities. And the Democrats were slow to figure that out.
We've been speaking with Jonathan Haidt. The most recent book co-authored with Greg Lukianoff is The Coddling of the American Mind. Jonathan, thank you so much for speaking with me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Dave.